Hello, my friends. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we're going to discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything we're going to be talking about today is for educational and entertainment purposes only. So please see a licensed professional if y'all have any specific medical concerns or questions. Yeah. Welcome to another stream, everyone. Hope y'all are doing well. We've got a couple of things on the pipeline today. So, so we're going to go ahead and dive in early. So we've got a couple of cool things going on, or a couple of cool things to talk about today. So we're going to be talking a little bit about nostalgia today. We're going to be talking a little bit about putting on a mask and keeping a mask on. We're going to be talking a little bit about careers and how people tend to think about careers, why we think about careers the way that we do, how it can be sort of like unpleasant to not really, think about careers in the right way. And so how shifting our mindset or changing our approach to earning money in our career can actually help us perform better and feel happier. So I'm seeing from Shishina that, nostalgia is something I struggle with, accepting things and moving on. Absolutely. Yeah, and putting on a mask. These are all... Oh, it'll get fluffy. The hair will get fluffy. Don't worry. I showered later today, so the hair is still a little bit wet. They call me String is saying, Dr. K, you've changed my life, hopefully in the positive direction. So it's always unclear. I saw something funny the other day about, what's like one of the worst insults you've heard. And people were talking about, all kinds of things like, you're not the stupidest person on the planet, but you better hope that they don't pass away. And I was just thinking about, what's the worst insult that I have shared with someone? And the worst insult that I've shared with someone, and I used to get a kick out of saying stuff like this back when I was more of an asshole. But one time I told someone, you're exactly what I expected. And they thought it was a compliment, but it wasn't. How is it? Oh, it's exactly what I expected. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, back in the toxic gamer days, right? So that toxicity, I'm not immune to it, or I wasn't immune to it, and we try to get it under control and be compassionate. I think it's okay to have a part of you that is dark, right? We're not all perfect. And at the same time, just because you have a part of you that's dark doesn't mean that you want to give into it. You don't want to gratify your ego at the expense of someone else. And it's a work in progress. Oh, my wife? No. My wife is way more. I had no expectation. I had no idea what a good relationship was until I met my wife. And it's blown my mind, but in an absolutely positive direction. I hope your day is as wonderful as you are. No, I'm serious. It's not like a compliment. It's like, it's a truth, right? No, we don't want to become Siths. I know we mentioned Black Tantra the other day, but we're not going to go down that road. All right. Y'all doing good today? How's everybody doing? How's everyone's week going? Good, but not good. Very, very good. Lovesick. Ouch. Stressful. Drinking morning coffee. Hopefully it's delicious. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was reading a little bit about Aghori Sadhana this morning. And for those of you who don't know, there's a sect of Indian mystics that have gotten a lot of notoriety. So like sometimes when you'll see like people on the cover of National Geographic that are these like yogis that are covered in ash and are very scary looking, they're the Aghori Babas. And it's interesting. So they follow a branch of spirituality in which they believe in like really hardcore non-duality. And so they'll engage in practices that are considered abhorrent by the rest of, the religious and mystical sects. So they'll engage in practices. They sleep in cemeteries, right? Because that's creepy. Sometimes they will also use like human remains as utensils. So they'll like drink from skulls and stuff. They'll like actually do that. And then they'll engage in other practices that are considered abhorrent and equally bad, such as the consumption of alcohol, the smoking of marijuana, and the eating of meat. And so they engage in all of those practices, right? It's kind of interesting that those are all considered, right? Yeah, Elden Ring meditation. Yeah, so I'm pretty sure that Elden Ring is like channeling something like the Aghori Sadhanas. Yeah. All right, so people are like, where do I sign up? Yeah, so I think it's interesting because what they really try to do is try to find what is constant and non-dual through poles. So it's like you'll consume alcohol and then they'll like meditate and then they'll meditate while normal. And they'll sort of see like, okay, like what is the difference in this and like what remains the same in these two states. And I don't genuinely think that they, they just don't sit around and get high all day. Like, I don't think that's what they do. They will really use this as part of a spiritual journey. The other thing about Aghori Sadhana is that it's temporary. So generally speaking, they'll go and they'll practice this for a few years and then they will return to their guru. So like, it's like an exchange program usually. Yeah, it sounds like an excuse. I think the thing is, so I think this is what happens, right? So like in a lot of spirituality, if we talk about false spirituality and real spirituality, you have some people that are doing, I don't know if it's fair for me to judge, but I'm just going to go and say it. I think you have people who are engaging in these practices and are like truly spiritual, right? So they devote their life to this and they'll do other things as well. They continue to do yoga and stuff like that. But they sort of like let go of their worldly attachments and meditate a lot. And then what happens is we have, maybe this may be a little bit, unfair of an indictment, but especially people who are into like the new spirituality, right? Like the new age folks who are like tend to be Western. And then what they'll do is use the fact that the Aghori Sadhanas are using marijuana and alcohol as a justification for their own use of marijuana and alcohol. Like, so they'll say things like, oh yeah, like since they meditate on it, like I can meditate on it too. But I think that's where you got to be super careful, because a lot of times what I've noticed is that people will use spirituality as an excuse, like their mind will use spirituality as an excuse to engage and indulge in whatever behaviors they want to. Right? So it's like, oh yeah, like I'm going to live free of attachment, which means that I'm not going to pay my bills. I'm living free. I'm living in the present, which means that, I'm going to have sex with whatever I want to, whenever I want to. And my long-term relationship is not that important. Right. So they'll use spirituality as almost like an immunity potion against responsibilities of life. But the key thing to remember is that the Aghori Sadhaks are not doing other stuff, right? They're not on Twitter. They're not going to birthday parties. They're not celebrating anything. That's like all they're doing, right? So they're living there for years and sort of like focusing on spirituality to the exclusion of everything else. So spiritual egoism, yeah, absolutely. So there's like, one of my teachers once told me there are two kinds of ego. There's the ego of having no ego, and then there's regular ego, right? Oh, look at how egotistical all these people are. And look at how humble I am. Yeah, spiritual ego being weaponized is probably the most dangerous weapon in the history of humanity. Right? Weaponizing spirituality and religion is like... Because it's interesting, because once you start weaponizing spirituality and religion, and this is where people will say, oh, but there's a difference between spirituality and religion. I generally agree with that, but I think that the key thing there is that in the pursuit of this more noble goal, I will act like an asshole. And that's something that both spiritual people and religions have done, right? In the service of this greater goal, for this, in order to save your soul, we've got to burn you at the stake. Right. So it's interesting, because I think that these like nobler pursuits are used as justifications for the mind. And that's like just a general principle, whether you're like a tiny little person or a massive religion. Yeah, it's interesting. People say that, oh, like people are talking about meditating in a cemetery or a graveyard, where it's like, actually, it's not going to be, in a sense, that different. But the other interesting thing is, at least like where I've lived here in the United States, like cemeteries tend to be pretty peaceful and beautiful places. Like they're incredibly, you'll have like well manicured stuff. It's like quiet. People are respectful. Like there'll be a lot of beautiful flowers everywhere, right? Like we try to create a space that is conducive to contemplation and reflection. So it's interesting. Yeah, not in India. Yeah. Okay. Should we get started? Vibin', chillin'? Okay. Let's start with this. Okay, I'm going to let's do a quick poll. Okay. Maybe we'll do one later. Okay. Nostalgia is not as pleasant when you're depressed. So for most people, nostalgia is generally accepted as being a nice feeling, a pleasant memory. But for me, it just reminds me of a more innocent, happier time when I was a child. I thought my future was good, and all I cared about was playing with friends and climbing trees. How things have changed. Edit, I genuinely didn't expect so many kind comments, even on a sub like this. I feel better, and I have you all to thank for that. I know exactly how you feel. I'd kill to go back to the days of running around the forest in my old neighborhood with my old friends. We've all gone our separate ways. Some of us were best friends from the age of 3 all the way to college, but we have now all gone our separate ways. I mean, I cherish the memories with my friends and will forever be grateful, but nostalgia hurts. Stay strong, friend. Here if you need to talk, sending good vibes your way. So it is interesting, right? That we tend to think about nostalgia as a good thing, right? So it's like, oh, the good old times. And when you go back in time and you start thinking about the good old times, you like smile, right? You start to think about, oh, like life was simpler. And we also see this like generationally, where there's this sort of thing where, the older people like the older generations, and I think this is like pretty common throughout humanity. I don't really know. I haven't studied it, but they start to think that the world is going in the wrong direction and the world was like simpler and better when I was young. So we sort of had these like rose-tinted glasses when we look into the past. The challenge is that sometimes when we look into the past, it can be like depressing in the present. And especially for people who sometimes do feel kind of sad or depressed, what they can really do is romanticize the past, and it can really become like, it can make you feel like you've fallen so far and that, things have gotten so much worse and like things in the past were so much better. And so before we kind of, so then the kind of question becomes like, was the past actually better? Like, is the present actually worse? Like, what's going on here? How much of this, and especially if we're talking about depression, is there some amount of cognitive bias at play? And so this is the kind of thing where you can sort of look at these older generations and you can look at things like cognitive bias and you can sort of logically say, I don't know if this is correct or not, but I'm sure you could make an argument that things in the past weren't better, that that's actually just in your head and that the present is just as good as the past and that we have a lot of things to look forward to, a lot of things to be hopeful for, right? So there's sort of that argument which you can make. But I think what's really useful is if you're someone who's kind of struggling with nostalgia, or if you're someone who is really looking back into your past life and sort of like, not past lives, I mean like your past. And you're sort of seeing that, oh man, like things were happier for me then than they are now. Like, let's take that sentiment seriously, right? So instead of dismissing it and saying, oh my God, it's cognitive bias, let's try to take a look at it somewhat seriously. And let's try to understand what are the features that lead you to that conclusion. And if the past was better, can we actually be a little bit scientific and start to wonder, okay, what about the past made it better? Because we look at these things like circumstances and stuff like that, but I'm not so sure that that's what actually makes the past better. So, and the interesting thing is that if we can really start to understand the nature of why the past was better, because that's your experience, right? Why the past is better, maybe we can try to understand how the present got worse. And then the cool thing is that if we're lucky, we may be able to figure out a roadmap to sort of get back to that place. So let's kind of take a quick look at this, okay, and run through, what's going on with nostalgia. So let's kind of recap. So the first thing is that for nostalgia, some people nostalgia is pleasant, and for some people nostalgia is unpleasant. And for the people for whom it's unpleasant, there's a sense of change, right? There's a sense of loss. And in the pleasant nostalgia, things were simpler. Now my life is more complicated. It's harder. Right? So we'll have these kinds of thoughts. And then remember, we sort of talked a little bit about the potential of cognitive bias. Right? So what's the level of cognitive bias? Is this kind of generational romanticism? Is this depressive bias, right? Because when you're depressed, your mind is going to be looking at different kinds of things. Like, what's going on here? So we could kind of acknowledge that. But we have to be super careful, because if we sort of dismiss your experience, if we say like, oh, like you're depressed, it actually wasn't that great and your life isn't that bad right now, that doesn't actually help you. So what I'd like to explore today is what are the features that make nostalgia pleasant? What are the features that make the past more enjoyable? Because if we can understand those, then we can start to dig in to potentially recreating it in the present. So first, let's kind of take a step back and take a look at nostalgia from sort of a clinical perspective. So why does the brain even do nostalgia in the first place? Like, what's going on here? Why does the brain think about the past? What advantage, if any, does it serve? So a couple of axioms, a couple of assumptions that we're going to make. The first is that the more I've come to understand the human brain and psychology, the more I've come to appreciate that even the things that cause us pain serve some kind of function. And on the simplest level, the fact that we feel pain, right, that makes our life worse. So why on earth have we evolved pain receptors? Because all it does is hurt us. And that's because pain actually helps us survive, right? So pain is a warning that something is wrong, whether it's emotional pain, physical pain. If someone is toxic towards me, and I feel emotionally hurt by them, that's my brain and mind's way of signaling to me that this could be a dangerous interaction. Maybe this person doesn't belong in my life. Things get super, super complicated though, and we sort of end up, encouraging that person's abuse of us in some cases and things like that. So that's why we're going to kind of dig in and try to understand, why are we nostalgic in the first place? So we know from studies on especially things like grief and studies on trauma processing that things like rumination and dwelling on the past are necessary components to emotionally process. And then if we emotionally process, this essentially causes us to move on. So what we can see is that like dwelling on the past serves a function, okay? We also recently talked a little bit about counterfactual thinking, which, just to give you guys a quick refresher, is when we think about things that did not happen. So when I go into the past, let's say I got a B on a chemistry test or C on a chemistry test. What my mind will do is something called counterfactual thinking. So it'll go back into the past and it'll imagine scenarios that are factually not true. If I had studied, I would have gotten a B. If I had studied more, I would have gotten an A. If I had done this, what if, if. This is essentially if thinking. Because then what your mind is doing is it's thinking about things that are factually incorrect. And so what we know from studies on counterfactual thinking is that this serves an adaptive purpose too. It helps us correct our behavior. And it also sort of creates a sense of regret that can be used as a motivational drive. Right? So sometimes this can get out of control where like the regret gets so powerful that it negatively impacts our motivation. But generally speaking, counterfactual thinking is something that we engage in a lot, right? So we can engage in it. We probably engage in it several times a day for all kinds of little things. Like, oh, if I had warmed my tea, for example, for 40 seconds instead of 30 seconds, it would have been warm today. It would have still been warm, right? So then I take a sip. And I'm like, maybe I should have used an insulated cup because this amount of unpleasantness can cause me to change my behavior. Because the truth is that negative emotion is a very powerful influencer of behavior. So I don't know that either of these things are necessary nostalgia, but we do know that the brain, generally speaking, or the mind, has different functions for going into the past and sort of like thinking about things. Okay, so this is kind of like 3 examples of maybe why we get nostalgic in the first place. So then the question becomes, when we think about the past, was the past actually better? Now, if the answer is no, so one option is no, and then why do we think it's better? Because of cognitive bias. So that's okay, right? Because if this is the case, then what we need to do is cognitively reframe, which is a useful skill. So this is something that we actually teach people who are depressed. They'll start to think, oh, in the past, like things were so much better. My life sucks now. And you can cognitively reframe to sort of develop a sense of gratitude. Actually, there are things that I can still be grateful for, right? Some things in my life have gotten better. But in the depressed mind, it doesn't automatically do that. So we'll actually sort of create cognitive flexibility through things like cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay. And then in terms of developing gratitude, this is things like metta meditation. So we can actually deal with the cognitive bias or deal with sort of this idea that life is actually worse for me now, because it may not be worse. But I don't think I think that's a very dangerous solution, because what we're sort of doing is like, we're not assuming that life was better, because maybe if that was your experience, it actually was better. And if we assume that life actually was better, Then what we need to do is explore, okay, what are the variables that made life better? Because if we can understand that, we can potentially recreate those. Okay? So the first thing that I want to kind of talk about for a second is when you're young, things are in a lot of ways actually better, right? So when you're young, so I'm going to just share with y'all a story from my own life. So when I was like in middle school, I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. And I had a lot of fun playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. And so I would we would play D&D basically every weekend. We'd play until like 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning. We'd play till dawn. And it was just a blast, right? Because back then I did not worry about stuff. Now that caused me some problems later on. So especially going into high school and stuff, my grades started to drop, things like that. I started playing video game. We would also have LAN parties, right? So it's not just D&D. It would be like, we're going to do D&D this weekend, or we're going to have a LAN party. If it's a 3-day weekend, we're going to do a LAN party. We're going to bring all our computers and stuff like that, right? Over Thanksgiving and Christmas, I remember when I was in college, I had like all these ideas of like, oh my God, like I'm so far behind on chemistry 1. I need to like really catch up because I got a D and I'm going into chemistry 2. And if I don't like learn chemistry 1, chemistry 2 I'm going to be screwed for the second half of my freshman year. But when Christmas rolls around and all my friends are in town, like we're gonna grind D&D because I haven't seen these guys in so long. So there are particular consequences that happened later on, but especially when we look to earlier times in our life, we don't have as many responsibilities. And so then you may think, okay, well, now that I have responsibilities, does that mean that I'm screwed? But no, let's actually tunnel down a little bit further. What is the effect of a responsibility on your mind? So when we think about what responsibility does, okay, responsibility gets us to think about the future. So if I'm like responsible for something, my mind will start thinking about the future. The other thing that tends to happen as we get older is that we tend to have regrets, right? Hence the nostalgia. So as we get older, by definition, our mind starts thinking more about the future and thinking more about the past. And this is like absolutely neurodevelopmental. So if you look at something like you talk to a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, their concept of time is not very well developed. And so as a result, like, if you ask a 4-year-old, like, what's going to happen next year, they don't know what a year is. So as we get older, our concept of time continues to evolve and grow. And even with things like social interactions, so as we enter puberty, we start to realize that people will form opinions of us that will be lasting through time. So even an 8-year-old may know what a year is, but they don't think in terms of like, how is this person going to think about me 1 year from now? So we start to add a temporal dimension to people's opinions of us during our teenage years. And so in that way, we add temporal dimensions to all kinds of stuff. And as we start to get older, we add a temporal dimension to the past, because an 8-year-old doesn't really think about the past. A 12-year-old doesn't really think about the past, right? A 15-year-old starts to think about the past. 16-year-old thinks about the past a little bit more. 25-year-old is thinking about the past. 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old starts thinking about the past way more. So the temporal dimension as we get older grows. And if we look at some of this philosophy from like yoga, what they sort of say is that the more that you live in the present, the happier you're going to be. And that a huge source of unhappiness comes from living in the future or living in the past. That when I create expectations for myself a year from now or 2 years from now, and when I think a lot about the consequences of my actions, oh my God, what happens if I don't go to this party? If I do go to this party, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? What's going to happen? The more I start living in the future, the more my happiness gets destroyed in the present. The more I start living in the past, the more my happiness gets destroyed in the present. And so we can sort of see that as you become nostalgic, it can recall positive emotions. But generally speaking, anytime I recall positive emotions in the past, I have to be careful, because if I'm not careful, what I'm going to do is that's going to create a contrast in the present, which is going to create negative emotion, which is sort of the function of the future and the past in terms of how it affects our mental health. So if we think about why was the past so pleasant, it's because we were kind of like living in the present, right? Living in the present is what creates pleasantness. And as we get older, I know this is not our fault, because if we really think about it, our society objectively makes us think more about the future and more about the past as we get older. We have the luxury of living in the present when we're kids. Our brain lets us live in the present. Society lets us live in the present. As we get older, both of those things change. And this is where I think we make a huge mistake, because we don't teach or prepare people for this change, right? So we'll say like vague things, like we'll say like, enjoy your youth while it lasts. But like if someone tells you that, they just say that and they laugh, and then you're like, okay, right? No one is ever like, hey, here are the ways that you enjoy things. Here is what's going to change for you, right? And it's like here, and the other thing is that sometimes people will tell us, like, by the way, adulthood sucks. Like, by the way, like you're going to have a mortgage to pay one day. Okay, so like, how do I cope with that, right? So they may even tell us what changes, but they don't tell us like, how do I deal with that? Because the truth is that objectively, as you get older and your responsibility increases, society pulls you away from the present. But we're not taught how to hang on to that presentness, right? So we're like, it's a skill, but like we're not taught that skill. And this is the issue, is that when you're young, living in the present is easy. It becomes very natural and no one pushes you out of it. But as we get older and our brain develops, we're not taught how to remain in the present, even though society and your mind are pulling you into the future and pulling you into the past. So this is a big problem, right? So like, let's look at it objectively. Like as you get older, like you're going to have, you know, when you're 10 and you go to school, you don't have to think about the semester. You don't have to think about your grade. You just go to school, you get your homework, you go home, presumably do your homework. Occasionally you'll have a test. You kind of have to study for the test, but not really. So you don't really have to think about the future. As you get a little bit older, you have to start thinking about tests. You have to think about studying. Then you have to think about paying bills. Then you have to think about paying mortgages. Then as you enter, you're like, it varies depending on your culture and your situation, but like, then you enter into this whole marriage and kids dimension where it's like, you know, you'll meet someone one day, like you're not really too worried about it, maybe in 1920, if you're lucky. You're still able to live in the present. But then we'll also see like 19-year-olds and 20-years who are terrified of being alone for the rest of their life. And I saw these posts where people are like, I've been perpetually alone. I'm 19 years old. And it's like, how long is perpetual? I've been alone my entire life. I'm 16. And it's like, you know, it's kind of weird to me being as old as I am. I mean, that's their experience and it's terrifying for them. So I try not to judge. But it's kind of interesting, right? So if you look at that person, why is the 16-year-old unhappy for being alone their entire life? Versus the 16-year-old who's like, yeah, I'm not dating. I haven't dated anyone. So like, I'm not dating is more happy. So like, let's just like look at this, right? So let's look at what adding the temporal dimension does. I'm not dating. Let's do this one actually. I haven't dated yet. Let's do this one. Been alone my entire life. Okay? Now here's the thing. All of these statements can come from a 17-year-old, right? Like this person can objectively be the same age. But and I would say that like this has the least amount of temporal. This is like medium temporal. And this has a large temporal. Y'all see that? So literally adding the temporal dimension is going to correlate with suffering. Right? And even as a therapist, if I'm working with someone like this, the process of cognitive reframing is going in this direction. Right? I'm just not dating. And this is like in the present. Okay? So as we get older, it's kind of interesting, but like there's an element of temporal dimension which gets added to our lives as we have to start thinking about mortgages and stuff like this. And that's where like we tend to start worrying about stuff and we start to feel nostalgic because life was so much simpler. Because life was simpler. Like objectively, it was simpler. You don't have to pay a mortgage. Your parents weren't like asking you when you're going to have kids because they want grandkids, right? And like you're sitting there, you've got $100K in student loan debt. I'm assuming you're American. Okay. You've got $100K in student loan debt. You've been dating someone for 2 to 3 years. Housing prices are through the roof. You have no idea if you're going to be able to afford a kid. And all of that anxiety and all of that worry and all of that pressure, your parents don't really appreciate, right? So we add so much temporal dimension. Our society adds so much temporal dimension because we need it to survive. That's the way that life works. The challenge is that we don't really understand that that's what we're doing. We don't really understand that that's where the unhappiness comes from. And the most devastating thing is that we also quickly jump to the conclusion that that's the only way to do it. What other choice do I have? This is the way the world is. Got a big choice, right? Because how much have you tried to step away from the temporal dimension? And this is where you're going to say something like, oh, like what? I should just stop paying my bills and ignore everything? No. Right? Because those are realities. We're not saying ignore them. But how much does thinking about it actually help it? Right? So if I've got a bill to pay at the end of the month, there's a certain amount of like thinking I have to do about it. There's a certain amount of work I have to do about it. But it's my inability to stop dwelling on it that destroys my happiness. I'm not saying that objectively it's better to have more money and like not have bills to pay and stuff like that. That's my whole point, is that there's an objective decrease in the quality of your life once you become an adult in some ways, right? But we can also cognitively reframe because I can have cookies for lunch today if I want to. There are some advantages to being adult. That's where the cognitive reframe comes in. But let's assume for a moment that objectively your life is harder as an adult than a kid. And that nostalgia was there because you were free of all of your future and past thought. So what can you do now? Okay, so there are a couple of important issues that we need to remember, okay? So the first, how to deal with nostalgic loss. So the first thing is that we assume the circumstances create the happiness. So I'll give you all the example, right? So I used to play a bunch of D&D. And so I'm now 39. And like, I thought like, so I got together recently with some friends of mine and we started playing D&D again. And I was like, man, it's going to be dope. I scheduled like a bunch of stuff. And I was like, we used to play D&D until 3 or 4 in the morning and it's so much fun. So we get together at 2 in the afternoon and we're all old men now. And like, we can't play D&D till 4 in the morning. We can't eat like Taco Bell and drink Mountain Dew by the liter because we're like old men. And so like, we'll do things like, we'll make like a fruit plate and we'll play for like 6 to 8 hours. Yeah, my back aches by 7 p.m. You're damn right. I can't sit in a chair for 8 hours. We got up and we'd take a walk in the middle. Like we'd go out for a walk. And like some of us, like I even started doing yoga. We were doing like push-ups randomly during the middle of the D&D session. Like we just can't handle the debauchery anymore. Right? You're damn right, grapes and cheese. Not just grapes and cheese. It was like strawberries, like one person brought pita crackers, there was hummus, it's like protein, right? And so this is the thing, is that we assume that it's the circumstances. And then what we try to do is we try to recreate that happiness. Right? Because this is what the brain does. The brain is like, what made me happy in the past, that will make me happy in the future. Okay, and now some of y'all are saying this is mature D&D. It sounds dope. But here's the thing. If I'm trying to recreate my teenage experience of D&D, it's going to feel like it sucks. It's nowhere near. Dude, we played so much D&D. And it's like we just can't handle it anymore. So then what you can do is lean into that, right? Make the most of it and be like, all right, we're going to do like mature D&D. Right? This is what we're going to do. So like now we plan our menu ahead of time. We're like, all right, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. You know, like we're going to do some of this stuff. You guys want to take a break? Oh my God. So we try to recreate that happiness, and thereby we actually lose sight of the present. So instead, when you kind of notice like your current circumstances, you can actually lean into your present to create happiness. But as long as you're trying to hold on to the past, it's not going to work. And this is the kind of thing where people will say, don't hold on to the past, but then everyone's like, how do I do that? Like, what do you mean by that? What does that practically look like? What does it mean to not hold on to the past? What it means is to recognize that the past is gone, recognize that your situation has changed, and try to like literally adjust your current situation based on your circumstances. So forget about the past and say, okay, I want to play D&D. I like D&D, but I'm 39 years old. I have these friends. We have these time commitments. How can we make this experience as enjoyable as possible? How can I make the present enjoyable as possible? That's how you let go of the past. And you optimize it. Okay? The next thing to understand is that, like, we sort of talked about this a little bit, but, you know, learning to live in the present is key. And the key thing here is that we have to understand that this is going to be harder as you grow older. Because it was natural for you earlier. But over time, society in your brain is going to add a temporal dimension. The temporal stress is going to increase. So what you actually have to do is, it used to be automatic, like it was easy, right? It's like back when I was in the 5th grade, I didn't have to study, so I never developed good study habits. So then when I hit college, like I was SOL, because now what's going on is like, this is my, let's say, intelligence, and here is the difficulty of the material. And so this is the gap where I should be learning how to study. And if I don't learn how to study then what's going to happen is like, I'm going to be screwed once I cross this threshold. Right? This is going to be like GG. This is the GG zone. And in the same way, this is what you can say the same thing about living in the present is a skill. So mindfulness is a skill, being able to meditate. So over here, it's really easy. Like we don't have to learn how to do it. And then we hit this point. But then what happens is like, no one is like, hey, by the way, the reason that you're struggling right now is because you have not learned the skill of living in the present. And then as things get like more and more, right, we get more and more overwhelmed. This redness gets like more and more intense. The higher up, the bigger this gap is right here, the more we begin to suffer. And then we find ourselves in our 25-year-old, 26-year-old, 27-year-old. If you're in the US, for example, student loans, like when you're 18 years old and you take out $120,000 of student loans to pay for college, you don't really have a temporal appreciation. But when you're 25 and 26 and you're paying off your student loans, and you recognize that like this is going to have a temporal effect for the next 8 years of your life, boy, does that hurt. Right? And then that's the barrier of this pain. And this is where people are sort of talking about things like, oh, like, you know, cancel student debt and stuff like that. And it's not my place to comment on whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. But what I'm saying is that you can cancel student debt, but it's not the other thing that you can, not the other thing. In addition to that, learning how to live in the present is a skill. So this is where like the solution to these temporal problems, people are sort of looking for circumstances. They're looking for like this thing to change and come down here. So we try to recreate the circumstances of being debt-free. We try to recreate the circumstances of playing D&D. We try to recreate these circumstances of the past. The problem is that the more we lean into that strategy, the more screwed we are because you can never get the past back. That's a big revelation of living in the present. So the third thing to understand is that life is changing and transient by nature. So this can have a couple, and I encourage y'all to just think about this, because this can have a couple of transformative impacts on your life. So when you start to think about how life is changing and transient, the first thing that happens is people get terrified. They're like, how do I hold on to something? Because that's what we want to do, right? We want this happiness for the rest of our lives. And so then what happens is like, if we're not even careful, The acknowledgement that life is transient damages our happiness, because then what happens is anytime we're happy, we're like, when am I going to lose this? When is the other shoe going to drop? When will this leave? And then you can't even enjoy it because you're paranoid about losing it, because Dr. K told you on the internet that life is transient and nothing lasts forever. So now I'm terrified because I want to hold on to it. But if you really kind of focus for a little while and you start to really think through it, it can transform. It's like hard. It's kind of binary. And this is where you got to meditate and really like just think about it, okay? If life is transient, how do you want to live? What's the only way to live? The only way to live is in the present, right? So you can sit there, you've got this one thing in front of you. This tea is cooling with every passing second. I can't keep it hot forever. So the only choice I have for happiness, the only way I have to enjoy the tea is to drink it now. Because I can't keep it warm forever. So the only way, the only solution is to act now, to embrace the present. And then what happens is like, it's kind of interesting because this can be transformed, because once you realize that now is the only time to enjoy it, you will enjoy it fully. Right? So I want y'all to think a little bit about like, you know, if you get one thing before you die, it's like a coin flip where that is either going to be like, you know, the best thing of your life, or it's going to taste awful because all you're thinking about is the impending loss. Right? So like once you realize that things are transient, like that's when you can really start to enjoy them. It's kind of bizarre. But once you realize that this flower is only going to be in bloom for this moment or this amount of time, and I don't know, instead of being paranoid about when the flower petals will fall off and when the fragrance will go away, just enjoy the flower. Right? And then you can look back on it. You can say, wow, that was a great flower. Then you have to be a little bit careful because you can say, oh, I wish there was another one. But the more that you're thinking, I wish there was another one, the more you're losing sight of the 1,000 things around you that you can only enjoy in this moment. And so once you adopt this kind of mind shift, which I'm not saying is easy, you have to understand that, like, look at all of the temporal influences on your mind, and then set all of those temporal influences aside for a moment. And this is why it's a practice, it's a skill. And try to enjoy just one thing. And then what you'll realize, which is like really neat, is that your enjoyment of the thing is actually determined by your presence in the moment. That even this tea, even though it's cooler, can still be enjoyed. Right? There's some things about it that I can appreciate. And so the more that you move in that direction, I'm not saying you should ignore your bills. It's just like work when you need to work and then have satisfaction that today I've done what I can. I've moved, sure, like, you know, I'm not making much money right now, but like I've moved in the direction that I need to like, it's going to take me 8 years to pay off my student loans, but I did what I could today. And I've worked for 8 hours or 9 hours. I did 1 hour of overtime. I've chipped away at it. And then I have 2 or 3 hours. I'm going to try to enjoy myself as best as I can. Right? So that's what it means to live in the present. Be cognizant of it. Recognize that your life may be objectively worse. And that you can still extract water from the stone that is life. It's absolutely possible. It doesn't feel that way, right? It feels like you can squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and you're not getting anything out of it. But that's because of the way that you're living. Because all you're thinking about is the 8 years of suffering. So even today, like whether you have 8 years of suffering or one, if you're paying off your student loans tomorrow, or you're paying off your student loans in 30 days or 30 years, the sandwich that you eat today is going to taste the same. You can either enjoy it or not enjoy it. Right? And this is where people are going to say, but yeah, but like if I didn't have student loans to pay, like I'd eat like a very fancy sandwich and it would taste better. Sure. I'm not saying that that isn't true, but even the humble grilled cheese can be delicious. But the more that you're in your head about paying off your debt, the less you're going to enjoy the grilled cheese. Yeah, and someone is saying being out of debt does not equal happiness, by the way, right? So that's another big thing. But that's exactly my point, is that happiness is somewhat independent of your circumstances. Because there's also data that shows that financial security makes people more happier. Or I wouldn't say makes people more happy. I would say is fertile ground for happiness to grow in. So in my experience, financial security and financial freedom is like the quality of the soil. You can still get a desert rose, but it's way easier with a bunch of fertilizer. This is all we got. How does that go over our heads? Because it's easy, because we're not thinking about what we have. We're thinking about what we used to have, and we're thinking about what we could have. That's how all we've got goes over our heads. So I know it's kind of weird, but at the end of the day, I think that nostalgia, like if we kind of just recap, right? So nostalgia is there for a reason. We know that there are a lot of different functions in the mind, whether it's trauma processing, grief processing, counterfactual thinking for performance improvement, which is why our mind goes into the past in the first place. Now, does the past seem better just because of cognitive bias and memories and selection bias and stuff like that? There may be an element of that, especially if you're in a depressive mindset, right? Because then you're going to compare and contrast, and you're going to come to the worst conclusions, and your mind is going to be like moving away from positive information. But I think if we sort of stop there, if I were to say, yeah, your brain does it because it's evolved to do it, and yeah, it's all cognitive bias in your head, that doesn't actually help you in this moment. Because if we look at it objectively, the past is usually better, right? If we're thinking about better times, like there's a lot to say about the past actually being better. And a lot of that has to do with our innocence. And what does innocence mean? Innocence means living in the present. Right? It means not having that temporal dimension. And what happens as we get older is we start thinking about time more. We have to. Society makes us do it. Our brains make us do it. And no one teaches us, by the way, as your brain starts thinking about time more, your propensity for anxiety will increase. Your propensity for regret will increase. Your fear of the future will increase. Your ability to enjoy yourself in the present will become harder. So let me teach you how to account for that difference. Right? Because we teach people how to stretch. Like kids don't need to stretch that much. Adults need to stretch a lot. You know, the number of adults that I've seen that have pulled a muscle, or the number of times that I've pulled a muscle when I was a kid, and the kind of crazy physical stuff that I used to do versus now, it's like night and day. I used to do way crazier stuff. And now, like picking up a child, I pulled muscle in my back by picking up a child. So as we like grow older, like we warn people. And so we have stretching baked into our society. Like you learn how to stretch even though you don't really need to as a kid. Right? But we don't teach us like what is that cognitive flexibility? What is the cognitive stretch that we need to do to be able to enjoy and appreciate the present? Because the more that we hold on the past, the more that we try to recreate the past, the more it's not going to work because life is different now. And so we have to learn how to like live in the present, learn how to craft things to our benefit. So instead of assuming if you liked a particular activity, instead of just trying to recreate that experience, try to optimize it for today. So how are things different? How can I make this as pleasant as possible? You know, when I'm making grilled cheese, should I switch from butter to olive oil? Because olive oil is a little bit healthier, right? There are all kinds of optimizations that you can do. Questions? How can we separate present thinking from making impulsive decisions? I could see it as a justification for doing risky things. You're absolutely correct. So present thinking is oftentimes used as like a justification for making bad decisions, right? We talked about that a little bit. So that's where I think that, let me think about this for a second. It's a good question. So here's what I'd say. Present thinking is not willfully ignoring the future or the past. So to be in the present means also a present focused appreciation for the future. right? So like, I don't know if this is going to kind of make sense, but it's sort of subtle. So in my present circumstances, let's say I have a $10,000 loan to pay. I can worry about the $10,000 loan. I can say, oh, I'm living in the present, therefore I'm going to completely ignore the $10,000 loan. But that's not actually living in the present, because in the present, you have that $10,000 of debt. So the real road is somewhere in the middle, where it's like, in my present circumstance, I have a loan, which I am paying off at the rate that I am comfortable with, and I'm going to enjoy today. I don't know if that makes sense. But sometimes what people will do is they'll use present-focused thinking as a way to ignore their present circumstances, whereas that's a present circumstance. You can't actually ignore that. And that's why it's a skill, because it's really easy to do one, and it's really easy to do the other. It's doing it in the middle where you're like, okay, I'm acknowledging that I have $10,000 of debt. I'm not going to pay it off today. I'm going to pay off $20 of it today, and I'm going to pay off $20 for the next, if I pay $20 a day over one course of, over the year, it'll be $6,000, right? More. $73,000. I mean, sorry, $7,300, right? So that's how you do it. It's like, I'm going to pay my $20 today. It's an appreciation of the debt. It's acknowledgement of the present. And like, I'm going to enjoy the rest of it, right? So I earned $40 today. I'm going to pay off $20 of debt. I'm going to enjoy the rest. Make sense? Yeah, so how do you deal with all the bad emotions like getting older, feeling lonely, lacking purpose? Do you have to confront those feelings? Absolutely. We'll get to that in a second. The next thing we're going to talk about relates to that somewhat. So like getting older has a temporal component, right? So like when we say like it has a comparative component. So the way that you deal with all of these kinds of things, so lacking purpose too, generally speaking, like lacking purpose is like a temporal emotion. I'm not like sitting there on the toilet. Like sometimes this can happen where you can have like an existential panic attack where like lacking purpose like hits you in the present. But generally speaking, lacking purpose is like a emergent property, right? You lack purpose over the course of a day or a week or a month or a year or a decade. And you can work on that. So that's where like confronting those feelings is important, because negative feelings are signals for you to change, right? So it's okay. Like you have to acknowledge them. Like if you're lonely, like that's something that you can do something around, right? That's also where like negative emotions are also compasses to move you in the right direction. So I was talking to someone who was an artist, and they were kind of saying to me that they realized one day that like they were unsatisfied with their music, and they used to beat themselves up about it a lot because of the dissatisfaction. But then one day they realized that the dissatisfaction of the music is like a sign of their good taste. And also when that feeling is satisfied, that's when they know they've made good music. And so they course correct over and over and over again, and they kind of lean into that dissatisfaction. And that's how they know how it needs to be fixed. So if they're dissatisfied with a piece of music that they make, what needs to be better about it? They make that change. What needs to be better about it? They make that change. And as they move in that direction, they wind up with satisfaction, and they wind up with award-winning music. And so even things like feeling lonely can be the same way. It's like, what are the times in your life? What should you gravitate towards if you feel lonely? What I've realized is that as I get older, I'm more likely to project my momentary pain as if life will be this pain from now on. What can you suggest to that? Remove the temporal component, right? So that's exactly what we're talking about. So your mind is going to project this present circumstance into the future. I'll be alone forever. Newsflash, you can't see the future. No one can. So that thought, I know is kind of weird, is like actually just wrong. Like, unless you have a time traveling machine or you're talking to someone from the future, you have no idea what the future holds. The other interesting thing to remember is that that is going to make all kinds of impacts on your current behavior. Because if this pain will last forever, if it's a certainty of the future, what does that do to your motivation? Right? So people have done studies on hopelessness in rats. And once you create hopeless circumstances for a rat, it's kind of a cruel study. It's a slight trigger warning here. What they'll do is they'll drop a rat in like a bucket of water, and they'll see how long it swims before it gives up. There's no way out, right? They don't actually drown the rat. Once it gives up, they pull it out. But that hopelessness, once you have hopelessness, you give up and you stop trying. And so the problem is that once we start to think that momentary pain is forever, we give up. The challenge is that unlike the experiment, there ain't no bucket and no one's going to pull us out. So there is actually a path forward. It's not artificially closed. It feels that way to us. But the moment we give up, that's when we actually drown. Because the circumstances are very different. No one's going to pull us out, which sucks. But on the upside, we're not actually in a bucket. Right? We're in a pool of water and there's a shore somewhere. There's land somewhere. So understand that your mind may want to do that. Notice the activity of the mind as it tries to project into the future. Notice what it does to your motivation and your desire for effort. And then recognize that you can't really, that thought is coming, that future projection is actually coming from an emotion. It's not coming from a logical place. And even if you say, but I have all this evidence, I'll be alone forever. Don't you see I'm 17 years old and I've asked out 2 people? Or I'm 25 years old and I've asked out 25 people. You can have as much evidence as you want to, but people can be alone until they're not. Right? That's where maybe you need to be a little bit more careful about how you ask people out. You may have some kind of red flag in your process. Right? So be reflective. Don't just assume the reason that you're alone may have something to do with your behavior. So I'm not disputing your evidence. I'm just saying that your evidence is incomplete and doesn't necessarily conclude that you shouldn't bother with anything. More practically, there are practices that can teach your mind to live in the present, to train yourself to be in the present. All meditation does this. So meditation will help with that. Okay? So Universal Emperor is saying the present sucks. I disagree with that in 98% of cases. So in my overwhelming experience, the more you lean into the present, the better life gets. I wish I could say 100%, but I've had a couple of experiences where all of my meditative strength and energy and mana and experience falls short for me with nausea and vomiting, which I just can't enjoy the present when I'm puking. I've tried. Boy, have I tried. But in most cases, including social things, work things, setbacks, all that kind of stuff, you can still enjoy the present. So dentists, I've managed. So I've managed to enjoy previously unpleasant dental experiences. I can make that living in the present check using D&D lingo. So that's a DC that I can handle. Nausea is just, DC's 30. I can handle a DC 18 dentist check. It's kind of weird. Yeah, we're just wrapping up with nostalgia, okay? So we're actually going to move on. Okay. So this is a tweet that someone sent me, I think from Shawn Mendes, who I understand is a musical artist of quite a bit of success, I believe. I'm not too sure, not too familiar with their work. So sometimes I ask myself what it is that I should be doing with my life. And what I always hear in return is to tell the truth, to be the truth. I feel like that's a hard thing to do, though. I'm afraid that if people know and see the truth, they might think less of me. They might become bored of me. So in those moments of feeling low, I either put on a show or hide. The truth is, in current form, is a 23-year-old who constantly feels like he's either flying or drowning. Maybe that's just what it is to be in your 20s. I don't know, or maybe that's just me. The truth is, I really do want to show up in the world as 100% true, honest, unique self and not care about what anyone thinks. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I really don't care what people think and I feel free. Most of the time, it's a struggle, though. That's the truth. The truth is, even with so much success, I still find it hard to feel like I'm not failing. Hyper-focused on what I don't have, forgetting to see all that I do. The truth is, I'm overwhelmed and overstimulated, lol. The truth is also that I'm okay. I'm just trying to tell and be the truth. I like to think that maybe me saying this might resonate with some people. So I think there's a lot of good stuff in here, right? So when I read this, what I sort of hear is that people say, be authentic, right? People say, don't care about what other people think. You do you. Haters gonna hate. But the truth is, like, it's not that easy, right? The truth is we do care about what people think. The truth is that oftentimes people who don't care about what people think are assholes, right? So it's like, how do you navigate this? Because you do care about what people think. And you're afraid that if you are authentic with them, that they're going to be bored of you or they won't like it. And where did you get that idea? Is that some fiction that you made up in your head? Unfortunately, probably not. The truth is that we learn how to not be authentic because being authentic usually doesn't go over well, right? So we learn how to hide because when our parents ask us, how are you doing today? And we say, I'm doing fine, Mom. And you see the relief in their eyes. You care and love about your parents. And so you don't want to let them know, like, what you're struggling with. Right? So when you say, Mom, I'm struggling, and then Mom doesn't know what to do, she can't help. And then she frets and asks me more questions, gives me suggestions, tell me to just exercise more. Here, I got you some vitamin D. It'll help. And then the next day rolls around and Mom is like, did you take the vitamin D? Is it helping yet? And then, like, she's trying so hard. She loves you so much. You don't want to disappoint her. Right? So you're like, yeah, Mom, it's really helping. I feel so much better already. And then she's like, oh, see the relief. Right? So how do we learn to not be authentic? Because, like, it pays to not be authentic. Right? Oh, you're in a job interview. Why do you want to work here? Because I have crippling debt and I don't have a choice. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Are you excited to work here? Yeah. I'm so excited. I'm going to try to do the minimum amount of work possible and inflate my resume to try to negotiate for a good salary. Right? How do we, like, being authentic is hard. Let's understand that. Let's understand that sometimes the world does not appreciate authenticity. Right? And it's not just like the negative situations. It's like, yeah, I'm going to wear this particular outfit because it makes me feel good and I don't really care what people think. And then when you're out there in Chad mode, wearing what you want to, not caring what people think, how do people feel about you? It's no personal thing to them, right? You're not doing anything to negatively impact their lives. But here you are living in authenticity, and I have to live my life a lie. I'm spending so much time and effort trying to look great for other people, and you're just out there enjoying yourself. How dare you? And so then, like, the jealousy, the envy, and the toxicity comes out. How dare you live your life when I am suffering? Authenticity can be a threat to other people, right? They don't like it. It's not fair. So being authentic is tough. It's tough in a lot of ways. So what do? We start to put on a mask. And what I want to do is actually sort of share with y'all sort of almost like a karmic perspective or a spiritual perspective here. So then, like, what happens? So when we put on a mask, we start to create this sort of situation, right? Where now I've put on a mask and I've created a certain amount of falsehood. And then I get kind of stuck because, like, if I want to live authentically, I have to correct that falsehood. And so if I tell my mom, actually, the vitamin D doesn't help at all, there's like the lying, there's the her disappointment, there's the why didn't you tell me? And then it's like you have another opportunity to put on a mask. Well, because when I am honest with you, your response actually makes me feel worse and makes you feel guilty. Like, you can be honest with, but then you don't say that, right? And so you just say, I don't know. And you're not authentic. So with each moment of authenticity, you're signing yourself up for some amount of pain. You're signing yourself up. And so now what happens is we've been doing this our entire life. We've been wearing this mask. So we have this like karmic backlog of like pain from authenticity. Because we've been living our life like sort of like a lie, right? And the more we live our life of a lie as a lie, like it piles up. So I once was working with someone who was just lying about going to school. So like, you know, they stopped coming to classes. And I was like, hey, I haven't seen you recently. They're like, yeah, I just do all my work from home and stuff like that. You know, it's fine. And then they were a friend of mine, so they continued to tell their parents, like, oh yeah, like school is going great, school is going great. They got engaged. You know, they were supposed to be in medical school, but they had kind of dropped out, been kicked out, etc. And just like continued living a lie. Would wake up every day, would leave the house, hang outside, like wander the streets for 8 or 9 hours, come home, tell their fiance they had a good day. They're super stressed because of work or because of school, pretending to be a med student. So with each of these lies, they're like building up this karmic debt of like pain and suffering. And it gets to be so bad that like you can't ever take it off. You can't ever come clean because there's just so much pain that you've built up. Right? And so that's where like, I know it sounds kind of weird, but this is why like I lean on the theory of karma here. And so it's interesting because it's not just the theory of karma. There's like evidence that this is damaging psychologically and evidence that dealing with this is actually good for people psychologically, which we'll get to in a second. So every time we put on a mask, we're just delaying or creating a potential pain in someone else. This is what I want y'all to understand. So the question is, how do we live authentically? Right? Especially if we've got this big backlog. So we're going to talk a little bit about Alcoholics Anonymous. So Alcoholics Anonymous, we're going to make a lot of generalizations here, okay? So it's not a perfect organization by any means. There's a lot of toxicity that happens within the organization. There are a lot of other addictions that people will substitute for instead of alcohol. But I think there are a couple things that they really get right. And so remember that Alcoholics Anonymous is also like a spiritual thing. So for some people, that really rubs them the wrong way because that spirituality turns into like religiosity and it turns into like a certain amount of forcing a particular perspective on other people onto other people. But I think there are elements of this that are spiritual that are really, really healthy. So Alcoholics Anonymous has this step called making amends. And this is really important because a lot of times what causes us to use substances is we have all these crushing karmic debts which are weighing on us, right? Oh my God, oh my God. We've got some kind of negative emotion in here that we carry with us. And that negative emotion is what causes us to reach for the alcohol more easily. And so how does making amends help with sobriety? We don't really know, but it does. So what someone who's in AA does is they start making phone calls to people that they have wronged. All these karmic debts that they have racked up through their drinking. They go and they start like telling people, hey, by the way, when we were dating, you know, I wasn't entirely honest with you. I lied about this, this, and this. And I actually, like, you mentioned a couple times that there was money missing from your wallet. I was the one who took it, and I took it to buy alcohol. I apologize for that. I'd like to pay you back. So that karmic debt, which they wanted to slide past, right? Because that's what we do. We go and we own it. We pay that price. We experience that pain. And it hurts. But something weird happens. This is what we don't quite understand. When you pay that debt, it increases your chance of sobriety. Right? As we start being authentic, because that's essentially what AA is doing, right? People who are making amends are like literally being authentic. They lied about something and they're going back in time and they're correcting it. So they make amends. And then this leads to a greater, a positive outcome in terms of sobriety. So there's some evidence that we don't know exactly what in AA works, but something about it seems to help people. Not everyone, right? Because there's also variability within AA and things like that. And there could be damaging things in it too. But there's something about paying this karmic debt. And that's what's hard about living an authentic life, because in that moment of authenticity, we're not delaying that pain, right? We have to experience it there, then and there. So when it comes to how do I live a life of authenticity, right? So how do I take the mask off? And this is where for some people, the amount of pain that they've racked up, the amount of lies they've racked up, the amount of karmic debt they've racked up is too much to handle. So you can't take the mask off and you can't be authentic, which is okay. I know it sounds kind of weird, but it's okay. So this is where if you can do something like go back and make amends, like that can be very, very helpful. It's going to feel liberating. And it's weird. The reason that I use spirituality instead of talking about the research of AA today and talking about karma is because I think the spiritual tradition has a better language that is like more accessible and more understandable and more relatable to the human experience than science does. It may not be correct, but it makes sense, and its utility can be greater. So if you're someone who's struggling to live an authentic life and you say like, how do I live authentically? It comes down to moments. Even if you've got this backlog, don't worry, I'm not telling you to go and make amends and start living radical authenticity. What you can start doing is stop accruing the karmic debt. That you can do today. Forget about all the crap that you have to pay back. Forget about telling your parents that you actually dropped out of school 2 years ago and you've been faking it. Right? Like you don't have to do that yet. Don't worry. But you can start living authentically today. Then when they ask you, when they call and they say, you know, how are you doing today? You can say, I'm really not doing well. Right? You can start there. So I'm going to give you guys a story. It's a bit more of a fun story. So one of my teachers was a Swami. Okay? So a Swami is like a religious, they're like a monk it's like the PhD equivalent of a monk. It's like a monk with a doctoral degree. So when you reach a certain level of like competence, basically like sort of the highest rank of monks, you become a Swami. So even within the Hindu tradition, there are two kinds of priests. There are everyday priests who can get married, have bank accounts, have children. They perform religious rituals and stuff like that. It's like their job to be a priest. They're like a professional priest. And then the Swami is someone who's taken sannyas, which means they've given up their life. So they're celibate. They don't own things. They're like fully devoted to spirituality. So they're like the hardcore priests. So by professional, I mean like it's their day job. Like the Brahmin's day job is to get people married, go home, watch TV, even have a beer if they want to. I don't know that alcohol is forbidden or not for Brahmins. I don't know. But the Swami won't drink alcohol. They won't do any of that stuff. So they're like the hardcore, like religious sort of like, you know, some of them are enlightened or whatever. So I was learning from a Swami, right? So Swami told me a story. So Swami is from South India, and Swami was traveling in Gujarat, which is where I'm from. So Gujarat is Western India. And in Gujarat, they have a particular vegetable called a bitter melon. So bitter melon is used in certain kinds of Indian and like Chinese cuisine that I know of, maybe other countries as well, I'm not sure. And bitter melon is called bitter melon because it's bitter. It like tastes like quite bitter. It's not tasty in a weird way. Like it's like, it tastes bad, kind of weird. So people will eat bitter melons. It's like very healthy for you though. And sometimes we'll like put enough masala, like we'll put enough seasoning in it to make it taste good. And it can be quite delicious. I actually like bitter melon, when prepared properly. So there's a certain kind of bitter melon which is pickled. So it's like sour and spicy and bitter, and it's kind of disgusting if you really don't like those flavors. And so when you're a Swami and you travel, like it's usually like volunteers and stuff, he's like traveling in India. So he's like staying at people's homes and stuff like that because hotels aren't really like a thing in parts of India. And so he's got like, his disciples and stuff who will drive him around and stuff like that. And so he'll go and he'll teach meditation and a lecture in this village, and then he'll go to that village or that city and give another lecture. He'll teach people meditation. He'll be initiating people and stuff like that. So he's got these people that drive him around. So he's staying at someone's house, and they serve him dinner. And so he's got, the chapati, which is like the flatbread. It's kind of like a wheat tortilla. And he's got different kinds of vegetables, and then dal, which is like a lentil soup. And then in the corner, he's got a little bit of like this pickle that he's never had before. So he tries it, and he's like, this is bitter. So I guess where he was from, bitter melon was not used. I don't know if it's used in other South Indian cuisine or not. But he's like, he never had it before. He's like, this is disgusting. Like, tastes awful. It's like bitter and sour, and I don't even... And so being a Swami is like, okay, like, I can't say it's disgusting. So he's also like, I don't want to like eat this throughout the meal. So the first thing that he does is finishes the bitter melon, because I'm going to finish the worst thing on my plate first so I can enjoy the rest of my food. So what do you think happens when you finish the bitter melon first? Huh? So they're like, oh, here, have some more. And he's like, no, really, I'm fine. And they're like, no, have some more. He's just being polite. There's more. Twice as much as the first time. He's like, fuck. So he's like, well, I ain't eating that shit last. So that's not my language, not his. Curse words are my additions to the story. So he goes ahead and eats it again, but he leaves like a little bit towards the end so they don't give him more, right? Because he's learning his lesson. So he's like left a little bit, finishes the rest of his meal, and then he kind of has the bitter melon second to last and has like one final bite of something tasty. Right? And they're like, oh, no, would you like more? He's like, no, I'm fine. So yeah, I still have some. Okay. So he's like, all right, done. So the next day, he travels to a different town, goes to stay with a different family. And sure enough, it's a part of Gujarati cuisine. So what does he find there? He finds the bitter melon. So he sits down, adding stuff to his plate. There's the bitter melon pickle. He's like, fuck me, dude. Again? So he has it again. Finishes it off. Sure enough, same thing happens again. He's like, oh, crap. I made the same mistake. These people are also insisting. So he learns, gets a second dose, saves one bite for the end. Okay? Third day, same thing happens again. He's like, what the hell? And he's like, so then he asks his disciples, and he's like, what's the deal? Like, I know that bitter melon is used here, but it seems like we're getting it every single day. And his disciple is like, yeah, of course, Swamiji. I saw how much you liked it the first day, so I made sure that you have it every day after. And I saw how much you enjoyed it, so it's, we're making sure that you're going to have bitter melon pickle every single day. Right? So, this is what you've got to understand. If you stop living authentically, you're sowing a karma, and that karma will reap its fruit. Okay? Can't avoid it. So when you live authentically, and you tell people how you feel in this moment, recognize that every time you're inauthentic, you are sowing a seed for the future. Whether you're an alcoholic who's stealing money and you want to try to get by, right? Like you're thinking like, I'm going to dodge it. I'm going to outsmart karma, right? I'm going to be like, I'm a Swami and I'm going to be polite and I'm not going to offend anyone. And when I go to someone's house, I'm not going to say I don't like something because that's rude. And this is the price you pay for your kindness. Karma is inescapable. Right? So when we live authentically, people are asking, how do I live authentically? So forget about going back and making amends for now. You should do that one day, absolutely. And if you're ready for it, go for it. But in this moment, There are going to be times in your life where for a fraction of a second, your mind will say, don't be honest. Your mind will say, your mind will say, like, don't be honest. Your mind will think about how the other person will react, and it will adjust your behavior in that moment to create a particular reaction for the other person. Don't give in to your impulse to shape someone else's behavior. That's how you live authentically. Like, it's a moment of time where you know, if I say this, this person will react this way. Therefore, I'm not going to say this. I'm going to say this instead, and then I will create their reaction. It is a manipulation, and it is inauthentic. And you are setting yourself up for a karmic problem the next time around. And even swamis are not immune. What if I want to be disrespectful? So authenticity, so this is important to understand. So in the Hindu tradition, right? So this is where, like, I'm not saying the Hindu tradition is right. I'm going to explain something from the Hindu tradition, a conclusion that some people in the Hindu tradition came to, and y'all decide whether this makes sense to you. There's satya, which is truthfulness, and there is ahimsa, which is nonviolence. Okay? And satya, truthfulness, should always be subject to nonviolence. I don't know about always, but generally speaking, should be subject to it. So you should not be truthful at the sake of being violent. So if you're ever concerned about which one should I do, you should try to be nonviolent first. So you can share something. So like, hurt and violence are two different things, right? So being disrespectful is about your intention. So you can say, this is disgusting. Who would be so idiotic as to, like, serve me this? That is being violent. That is being disrespectful. So it's not about the other person's feelings, it's about your intentions. So I don't ever advocate for being disrespectful. So being authentic doesn't have to be disrespectful. And that's where, like, some people use it as an excuse to be disrespectful. So you can say, like, oh, would you like it? And if someone offers you more, and you're like, no, really, like, I actually didn't like it very much, so I wanted to finish it first. This other stuff is so delicious. You can say that, right? And it's okay. You can just be honest. It doesn't, they don't have to go like, everything else is so delicious. This is the one weird thing. I've never had it before. We don't eat this down south. It's not exactly to my taste. That's not disrespectful. So don't be disrespectful, but be authentic. And in that moment, when you try to spare someone's feelings, I'm not saying set out to hurt them. That's what himsa is. We want to do ahimsa, the lack of violence. Right? Yeah, what if someone is sensitive and you lie not to hurt them? So that's where, like, you can speak the truth and you should do it with compassion, but you can't necessarily control someone else's reaction. This is another huge problem that we run into with being inauthentic, is we make ourselves responsible for other people's reactions. This is how abusive relationships persist. Because I learn that by being meek, I can keep someone from hitting me, which may have a certain survival advantage, but over time, it's not a good long-term strategy. Right? So when it comes to being authentic, like, recognize that it may cause some amount of pain. So you should do everything that you can to try to minimize that pain, but you don't necessarily need to lie. So if your mom is giving you vitamin D and it's not working, right? So, like, there's language around that too. It's like learning how to be compassionate. Is the vitamin D helping? Not yet, Mom. But I know that you do your homework. I know that you care about me and you told me to take it. So I'm going to take it every day if I have to until it works. Thank you so much. Right? Like, I mean, there are things you can say to mitigate it, even if it's not helping. just develop your soft skills, lol, it's not complicated. Like, so I'm hoping I can't detect sarcasm over the internet, but I'm not saying it's easy. But the whole point is that, like, we don't even try, right? So what happens when you start living a life of inauthenticity is you dodge the bullet entirely. Like, that's why it's hard, because we don't even try, right? So that's why you start with the smallest thing of authenticity, and you try to ask yourself, how can I say what I'm about to say and be authentic and be compassionate? So as you develop empathy, you can understand, like, just acknowledge where someone's coming from. Right? So if someone, like, gets you strawberries that have nuts sprinkled on them, and you're allergic to nuts, and it's Valentine's Day, and you've gone on 3 dates, and now it's that awkward period in your relationship where there's a Valentine's Day that's come way too early. GG. Do you celebrate it or do you not celebrate it? And there's nuts on the strawberries, and you're allergic. Someone's like, did you enjoy the strawberries? How do you tell them that you're allergic? By sparing their feelings. Right? What do y'all think? You can say, I know it's going to sound insane, but I'm actually allergic. It's such a thoughtful gift, and never in my life have I regretted being allergic, because those strawberries looked amazing, and it's clear that you put a lot of thought into them, and it's like, I've never wanted to be able to eat these nuts more than now. Right? Like, you can still say something. You can honor their gesture. Right? Okay. All right. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's beautifully put. So Clockwork Chaos is saying, appreciate what they did for you, not what you got out of it. Right? That's a beautiful way to put it. Beautiful way to put it. Right? So appreciate the gesture, even if it didn't help you. Right? You can acknowledge and, like, honor that for sure. Okay. Yeah, it's really five head. Okay, let's do one more, and then we're going to meditate. So my life improved dramatically once I accepted that I have no singular all-consuming calling, and instead just want to do a variety of stuff I kind of like until I eventually die. Makes sense. Right? So if we kind of look at this, we see a lot of questions about how do I find which career is right for me? Do I pick my passion or do I pick my job? Which one? Which is the right choice? So we tend to go through life or approach life kind of thinking binary. Like, there's a right thing and there's a wrong thing. There's a career. And even if it's binary, it's singular. Right? It's not like a multiple choice or, like, check all that apply. That's not how we go through life. We go through life like, true, false, binary, sometimes multiple choice, but you got to make one choice. We also don't think it's, like, certainly not like word problem with essay response. That's not what life is. Like, there's a right way to live life and there's a wrong way to live life. Even our language, it's so baked into our language. Are you happy with your career? Career is singular. It's like, people don't ask, like, do you enjoy your careers? No, like, a career is like one thing. Like, the concept of a career is that it's one thing that you do that you then, like, persist in doing for a long amount of time. And then if you do it for a while, like, and you make the right choice, then you'll be happy. And if you make the wrong choice, then you'll be miserable. I regret my career choice. I'm happy with my career choice. It's all singular, it's all binary, it's all longitudinal. And then furthermore, we also honor people who tend to pick one career, right? So like we'll look at people like, despite all the criticism, we'll look at people like Jeff Bezos, who built Amazon, and Bill Gates, who built Microsoft. Newsflash, there were other people involved. Warren Buffett, who built Berkshire Hathaway. Newsflash, there were other people involved. And when we look at success, we tend to look at like one thing that people worked on for a long period of time. And to be sure, there's a good reason for that. It's like, if that can absolutely apply. But I think that for a lot of people, the concept of a career isn't really about being the best at one thing, which is what people will tell you, right? They'll say like, just learn one thing and be the best at it, and that's the best way to deliver value. We don't talk about hybrids. It's all min-maxing and one-dimensional. But I think that there are some people who have the temperament for not doing one thing their entire life. And in fact, the way they can be the most successful is to do like a plethora of things over time. And they will bring their experience from each of these things to something else. And I say this as someone who is that way, right? So, and this is where like I learned this from kind of the concept of Ayurveda, which by the way, I know we've kind of steered clear of, so I'm going to share a little bit about that now. So some people were criticizing some of the papers that we cited about the ayurgenomics dimension of Ayurveda. So Ayurveda has different segments. So Ayurveda is traditional Indian medicine. There's actually good evidence for some of the herbal treatments and some of the interventions of Ayurveda, but some of the more personality-based stuff, I think we overestimated the quality of the evidence. So after doing a more thorough review, I think the critics were actually right. There's not actually very good data behind some of the Ayurvedic personality stuff. So I personally still think there's a lot of value in it, even if it is not actually that scientifically validated. And so that too, there's kind of a dimension there, which is that things can have heuristic utility or functional utility without being scientifically correct, right? So we create concepts that help us navigate life. And even if those concepts are not scientifically provable, they can be very useful. So we do this a lot in psychology, where we'll come up with like ego, right? Like ego is not a real thing. You cannot biopsy the ego. You can't detect the ego on an MRI. There isn't an ego part of the brain. It is an emergent concept which has a lot of functional utility. And we can sort of approximate it through factor analysis, but it's not necessarily a real thing. So what I'm going to talk about is sort of like, this sounds to me like a vata. Okay? So a vata is someone who has a very dynamic mind, who has shifting attention. And generally speaking, if you have shifting attention, you will really struggle to build one career over time because you get bored easily. You lose motivation and you get excited about other things. And so what most people think is that if you're a vata, you're screwed because like that's what leads to success, period, is to pick one road, go through it, don't be a hybrid. But in my experience, if you are like this, where you can't just do one thing and you kind of get bored easily, there's absolutely a way to lean into that and craft some kind of career, but really incorporate a lot of different careers over time that actually ends up doing pretty well. So I'm an example of this. So once I realized that I'm the same way as this person and I leaned into it, it worked pretty well. So I'm definitely not the best content creator on the internet, right? I'm not the biggest YouTuber. I'm not the biggest Twitch streamer. I'm definitely not the best doctor on the internet. Definitely not the best gamer on the internet, right? My MMR isn't that fantastic. And yet my ability to like weave these together actually creates like an emergent phenomenon that is okay. Make sense? So that's the kind of thing where like, if you're someone who's like, oh, this career isn't right for me, that's okay. And so this is what I would encourage you to do is like recognize that there are things from careers that can actually have more value in other places. So for example, I really, really, really I'm also not the best monk, right? Because I dropped out of that. But I incorporate spiritual teachings. I incorporate medical teachings. I incorporate concepts of psychology. I incorporate gaming analogies. So you can weave it all together. And this is something that I think is very, very incorrect about how we view success, is we assume that getting really, really, really good at one thing is the best way to be successful. So if you're someone who gets bored easily and gets excited about stuff, I'd say lean into that to a certain amount. And recognize that there are going to be principles from each field that you study that will help you in other fields. So the simplest example of this is actually, I mean, we can pick any. But as I think about my own life, I think about training to become a monk for a few years definitely helps with getting through medical school. It definitely helps with working with patients, right? It definitely even helps conceivably on, the internet in terms of making content. Similarly, principles of psychology and understanding communication, conflict resolution, behavior certainly helps in terms of corporate consulting, right? What's going on at this person's job? Let's try to understand the psychology and motivations. Let's try to understand what kind of behaviors we're reinforcing. So the principles that I learned from family therapy can be very, very useful in advising executives. What's the dynamic in the room amongst the C-suite executives? Not just executives, even people who are, frontline workers. And so even principles of, let's say, coding or design, right? Where design and architecture have been now used to do branding and marketing. So there are all kinds of principles that can be useful in other dimensions. Even video game stuff. So I sort of conceptualize, one of our coaches actually was really neat. So they came up with a character sheet system for their clients, where as they're coaching a client, they'll develop a character sheet and add traits. And the clients really like it. They're like, okay, this makes a lot of sense. I have plus 10 to this and minus 10 to this, plus 10 to this and minus 10 to this. Or maybe I shouldn't engage in that relationship because this person has this kind of style or whatever, right? So they take their real life attributes and stick them on a character sheet so that it helps in their reflection of that thing. They can reflect on it. They can understand it better. Real life character sheet. Right? So even playing games can be useful in coaching. It's interesting. So the first thing is that if you're someone who gets bored easily, that's okay. You're not doomed to failure. Lean into it. Couple of really, really important points, though, about structuring this. The first is that generally speaking, you want to cycle back around to your interests. And what do I mean by that? If you get bored of thing A, move to thing B. If you get bored of thing B, move to thing C. If you get bored of thing C, see if you can cycle back to A. Because if you continue making changes, if you dig 60 holes that are 1 foot deep, you're never going to hit water. But if you have 4 or 5 holes that you can dig 10 feet deep, you may hit water. And not only that, if you dig 1 hole 60 feet deep, you may not hit water. It may actually be a more advantageous situation to dig 5 holes 10 feet deep. Y'all see that? What if there's just no water down there? And you've invested 60 feet into it. So in that way, you can actually outperform people who are dedicated in one direction. It's I am a mattress salesman at a retail store, and this is what I've devoted my entire life to. I'm going to be the best mattress salesman in the world. And then COVID hits, and then these online retailers hit, and I've over-specialized and bred in weakness. Right? Ghost in the Shell reference. It's true. Over-specialize and breed in weakness. And so this is where it's okay to not do one thing your entire life. Don't get locked into it. Right? So you can do something for a little while, and if you don't like it, that's okay. I think it's okay to switch. You don't have to beat yourself up over it. But remember that everything that you do, you can learn something from, and you can carry something with you. If you're working retail for a year, and you're dealing with Karens every day, you're now going to be skilled at dealing with Karens. And maybe your next job as a developer, you're going to have a Karen for a boss. And whereas all of your colleagues are going to be frustrated, you are an expert at dealing with Karens. So you can handle it. Because the truth is that a lot of what makes people successful at work is not the actual like work, right? Half of it is the work and half of it is like all this interpersonal human stuff or internal stuff. It's like stuff like work ethic, organization, prioritization, communication, conflict resolution. You can work on all that in all these different scenarios. Right? So like there are even things where, for example, like I remember I was working at a residential addiction treatment facility and the staff was really, really stressed out at rounds. So rounds is when you sit down and you kind of discuss plans for the patients and stuff like that, talk to the patient sometimes depending on how you round. And so we started every day with a meditation. It's like, hey, like I know this week has been tough. We've got a couple of really hard patients. Let's like start with a meditation and then we'll get into rounds. So, you know, there are some people that spent 4 years doing research and getting publications before they went to medical school. I spent some time in India. You can carry it with you. So you don't need a career that is just one-dimensional. Whatever you do, you can carry with you, carry it forward. And recognize that you may actually have advantages against people who have spent their entire life in that career. I really understood this when I went to the GDC conference. And I talked to all these like programmers and developers and like people who are designing games. There's so much to be gained from like understanding psychological perspectives. Right? We were even talking about, so I gave a talk about reducing toxicity, and there's like basic stuff about behavioral reinforcement that I think the developers haven't really understood. And it's what's actually really amazing is how much developers have understood about player behavior without any kind of formal training. They've gotten so far without formal training. They're brilliant. And they're doing it blind. Right? So someone saying poker is great for this, like I don't know exactly what you're referring to, but it makes a lot of sense to me. It's funny because I've seen professional poker players do really well in other scenarios. So I've helped professional poker players transition to like other jobs. And so if you're someone who, you know, is worried about your career not being the right choice, like that's okay. The other thing is people will think, oh my God, I've wasted so much time in this career. That's okay. You'll be surprised at how much of it wasn't a waste. But I know it's so much about fluid dynamics and I don't know how to apply fluid dynamics to like other things. Well, you'd be surprised. Right? And so like it's not too late to switch. There are a lot of things that will carry over, things like work ethic, interpersonal dynamics, the ability to stick with something for a long period of time. You know, you're an engineer and someone's like, why would we hire you? You've been doing 10 years of like fluid dynamic stuff at a sewage plant. And you're like, well, I'm very detail oriented. You know, there's like some technical skills that I need to learn, but I'm happy to learn those. I have a strong work ethic. And frankly, I've wanted to leave the job for 2 or 3 years, but I'm not a quitter. And so if you hire me, like I'll make sure the job gets done, even if I don't enjoy doing it. And you can count because like, you know, if I don't do a good job, people get poop in their water and that's unacceptable. So I'm very results oriented. I'm very detail oriented and I'll work until the job is done. Right? So someone's saying, oh, Vanya's saying, I'm good at handling shit. Yeah, absolutely. Right? You say that in an interview. Why should you hire me? I guarantee you I'm the best at handling shit of anyone in your office. And they laugh and you have a positive connection. And then maybe you get hired. Yeah, so like, but even if what you say is 80+% is going to waste, who cares? How much do you really need? So let me ask y'all something. If you get a job, right? If you do start doing something, and you say, oh, but 80% of it is waste. Like, how much do you really get from the experience? Like, if I do a job for 2 years versus 10 years, how much additional work or additional gain do I get from the 8 years? Think about it, right? Think about it critically. So if I play Dota for 2 years versus play Dota for 10 years, what's going to be the effect on my MMR? So people assume, this is a huge mistake that people make, that devoting yourself 10 years to a career makes you better at it than someone who does 2 years. There's a disturbing amount of research from the field of medicine that the quality of your practice of medicine is determined within the first 2 to 5 years of practice. And that you will have doctors who have 4 years of experience who will outperform doctors who have 30 years of experience, very commonly. And furthermore, like that, the good doctors are determined early on. And we see the same thing in video games, right? You calibrate to your MMR, and like, if you look at pros, like pros in esports are not the ones that have the most experience. Like, I have more experience playing Dota, I think, or I've been playing it for more years. Actually, I don't know if this is a fair thing to say, but there are definitely people out there who have more experience than, like, you know, who've been playing Dota for more hours. I don't know about more hours, but longer than even like the TI champions from TI 10. So we grossly overvalue experience. They're like, oh my God, 80% of it is wasted. Like, who cares? You don't need 80% of it. All you need is 20%. So what it comes down to, F? Okay. What it comes down to, what'd y'all hear? What was the last thing? You can't trash talk Team Spirit. TI check. Okay. So what I was saying is that, like, people assume that experience is really important and scales linearly, right? We assume that, oh my God, I've been doing this for 10 years. All that experience is wasted. But how long does it take to get good? Are you, when you have 2 years of experience versus 10 years of experience, are you 5 times better than someone with 2 years of experience? Absolutely not. And you can see this if you look at esports, because you'll have people who played more hours who are like still sitting in the trench tier than people who are like winning gigantic international multi-million-dollar tournaments. So experience doesn't count for nearly as much as people think it does. And this is where, if you need to catch up, the cool thing is that deliberate practice can really help you catch up really easily. So if we look at people who are better, you know, there are people who've played 1,000 hours of Dota and people who've played 100 hours of Dota, and people who played 100 hours of Dota may be better than the person who's played 1,000 hours. How is that? It's because they're intentional about getting better. Right? They focus on it and they try to not even catch up. They just focus on getting better every single day instead of playing like zombies. And the truth is, most of people who are in careers like do it like a zombie, and they're sort of like passively learning. They don't really reflect very much, right? You just go to work and you work on more projects and you gain more experience and you kind of level up, but you're not doing like replay analysis of your games. So what makes people better? Replay analysis. Do you do replay analysis at work? When a project doesn't go well, what is your improvement process? Chances are it's run by the people above you. And so, like, how good is that going to be? Right? So what about your own personal improvement process? Someone's saying, I always do replay analysis at work, Chinese cabbage farmer. And that's why you get reprimanded, because you're watching Dota replays at work. Catching up is always faster than you think, right? So like people will say like, oh, I'm shifting careers, I'm starting behind. I finished medical school at the age of 32. I was like somewhere between 4 and 6 years older than the average person. And it's fine. Like, I'm doing okay, right? Like, I had a lot of worries when I was going into medical school. Oh my God, I'm so old. It's fine. You know, highly recommend doing what's right for you and making a shift if that's what you need to do. Right? Getting good is not about more time. It's about intentional. I wish we could have an interview of 20s Dr. K. My friend, y'all have had tons of interviews with 20s Dr. K. The people that we bring on stream, half of them are 20s Dr. K. Right? That's how we pick them. You want to have an interview with 20s Dr. K? Go talk to yourself in the mirror, depending on who you are. right? So it's okay. Like, if you're someone who has ultimately decided a career is not right for me, like, lean into it. You will be amazed at how much value you can bring to the table. Yeah, so for all, really, I think that the whole reason that this thing works and HG is a thing is because we're a lot more close to each other than we realize. And so lean into who you are, right? Don't follow the formula for success, because here's the biggest problem with the formula for success, being the next Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or whatever, right? Because we also have Elon Musk, who is like, I'm gonna build a tunnel from San Francisco to LA. I'm gonna send a spaceship to the moon. I'm gonna stick a Wi-Fi router on a satellite. I'm gonna buy Twitter. I'm gonna build electric car. I'm gonna build battery. Right? It's like, what, man? Like, where's the focus? Right? So it's like everyone who's looking at careers is like, we always look at these people who like pound away at one thing for 20 or 30 years and we assume that's the formula for success. It's not the formula for success. Here's the other big problem with the formula for success. The formula for success, all the success stories that we have, I know it sounds kind of weird, involve a person. But are you that person? Chances are you're not. And if you're not, what are the individual factors that go to that success? We look at their actions, but we don't look at the person. And so any formula for success that you follow that someone else gives you is going to work like it's going to be inefficient because it doesn't account for you. So if you're someone who wants to be quote unquote successful, and you have certain tendencies, you have certain stats, it's kind of like, if you have a strength build in Elden Ring and you see a bunch of people one-shotting things as a mage, and you're like, I'm gonna pick up a staff and I'm gonna be like them. But you got to play to your strengths, right? Like, what's your build? What's your nature? What are your temperaments? What do you like? What gets you to work the best? What makes you the most intrinsically motivated? It may not be doing the same thing day in and day out for 10 years. And this is where if you're worried about all the inefficiency loss and stuff like that, remember that people can do things. People can play a video game for 5,000 hours and still suck at it. So you can shift careers, and whether you do a good job or a bad job depends entirely on how much work you put in and how reflective you are. And when I say work, I don't mean just the hours. That's the other thing, is people assume that more work means more hours. No, that's my whole point. You can play Dota for 5,000 hours and still suck. That person has put in a lot of hours, but they haven't put in a whole lot of work. That's why they suck. Right? It's even like, I think it's Bill Gates, or I forget who said this, but it was saying you're like, oh, but I'm lazy. And it's like, Bill Gates is like, if you have a hard task, give it to a lazy person. They'll figure out how to do it the most efficiently. Even laziness can be an attribute that you can capitalize on. Right? Someone's like, why should we hire you as a developer? Well, you can be like, I'm lazy. Like, why is that an advantage? Because I design the best user interfaces, because I think about how to make things the easiest for myself all the time. That actually excites me, and I will actually be motivated to do that. And then they're like confused. The guy says he's lazy. Should I hire him or should I not hire him? You interview enough, someone will hire you. Okay? All right, shall we meditate? Is there a such thing as a meditation-induced psychosis? Absolutely. We've shared papers on that. You just do a Google Scholar search for it. So let's meditate. So I was going to teach y'all something a little bit different today. It's going to be a little bit more. So I tried to find something that would be both advanced and basic. So we're going to do a version of Om meditation today. So for people who are relatively new to meditation, you can just do the basic Om. But for people who have been practicing for a while, because we have our month of meditation still going on Discord, you can go ahead and like do sort of the advanced level of it, okay? So the other thing is that today we were talking a lot about interacting with the world, for lack of a better term. So we were talking about, you know, being authentic with the world, sort of like how you show yourself, sort of engaging with the world from a career standpoint. So what we're going to do is do a version of Om chanting that highlights externalization versus internalization. So let's kind of review what Om is and why we chant it. So Om is, generally speaking, composed of 3 syllables. Ah, ooh, and we start with the mouth fully open. Ah, go to middle open. Ooh, That's how we chant Om, okay? So what we'll do when we chant Om is we'll do 5 breaths or 9 breaths. You'll chant kind of 5 times, 9 times, whatever, with your eyes closed. The other thing that we'll teach frequently about Om is that Om is about, chanting is not about sound. It's about vibration. And what I mean by that is and I know that physics-wise, the two can be the same thing. But what I'm talking about is your experience of the thing is not about here, it's about here. So what I want you to focus on when you chant is the vibrations that you feel, not the sounds that you hear, okay? That's why we'll chant with our eyes closed. So for those of you who have not done Om, you can just start with that, right? So we'll chant, when we chant together, we're all practice together, but where your attention is going to depend on whether you're more advanced or more experienced, or less experienced, less advanced, okay? So you can just focus on the vibrations and chant, and that's like great. You'll get a lot of benefit from it. Now, here's sort of the additional layer to it. If you've been chanting and if you've been focusing on vibration, what you'll notice is that there's a difference in where it vibrates, like where you feel the vibration for each sound. And what you'll sort of notice is that the ah projects something outward, okay? And so you'll kind of feel like this vibration that's towards the upper part of your body, and it'll sort of feel like a projection outward. As you move to the ooh, you'll kind of notice that that sound is going to vibrate more around the throat. And if you really pay attention, you'll notice an upward movement and a downward movement. So that also sounds kind of weird, and you may not understand this until you actually practice, or until you've practiced a lot. So that there's going to be an outward movement with ah. There's a binary movement. There's sort of an outward flow and inward flow with ooh. And then there's going to be an internal movement with The will almost go straight down. So in that way, we can sort of notice these 3 directions of vibration with Om. Now, there's sort of a mystical component, which I'll just share with y'all, and up to you whether you want to put emphasis on this or care about this or what, right? So this is not really supported by science. But when we chant Om, there's also sort of like you can lengthen a particular syllable based on what you're shooting for. So if you want to create kind of an outward change, you can lengthen the ah. If you're trying to balance something between you and the outside world, you can focus on the ooh. And if you want to focus internally, or the reason you're meditating is for some sort of internal gain, then you want to focus on the okay? So we can go ah, ooh, if your goals of meditation are more like internal or spiritual in nature. If your goals are more external, right? So you can lengthen one part, or if you're sort of doing it introductorily, you can just kind of, do all 3 evenly, okay? And then if you're sort of trying to balance something between you and the outside world, if you're kind of like, then you can focus on the ooh. So ah, ooh. Okay? So if someone's asking, why can't new people do the advanced technique? You can do the technique is going to be roughly the same. The difference is going to be what amount of awareness, what your awareness is capable of. So when you chant, if you can really feel that difference, that's what makes it advanced, right? So if you can't feel that difference or are too focused on the breath or counting or whatever, like that's totally fine. You can still chant and you can move towards this. So whether you're advanced or basic, and it's not like the advanced is necessarily better than the basic. It all depends on what you're able to detect and what you focus on. So this is the other thing to understand is that sometimes people will get bored of a meditation. And that's where you can chant Om, but the ways in which you chant it and what you focus on can be drastically different over time. And generally speaking, when you chant Om or when you do a mantra for a very long period of time, unless you have a teacher who's guiding you with each step and who can discuss your practice, what you'll discover is that you'll find weird like nuances within the mantra and find different kinds of like connections with the outside world that you didn't know existed the first year you chanted it. And that's where, are these connections real or are they not real? Like what's going on? Like it's unclear to me. Like the human brain has a tendency to seek patterns and make patterns. So even if the pattern isn't real though, it can lead to a functional understanding which can help you navigate life. Okay? So we're going to practice now. We're going to do, let me just think how many breaths we want to do. So we're going to do 5 rounds. So round 1 is going to be 4 seconds, 4 seconds, and 4 seconds of ah, oo, and Round 2 is going to be, let's say, 8 seconds of ah, 2 seconds of oo, and 2 seconds of Round 3 is going to be 2, 8, 2, and round 4 is going to be 2, 2, 8, and round 5 is going to be 4, 4, 4. Okay? So the reason we're going to do this, it may be kind of confusing, but I'll kind of prompt y'all, is what I want y'all to really pay attention to is which one feels the best to you. Okay? So does doing equal amounts of ah, oo, and feel the best to you? Or do you sort of really get into it more when we're lengthening ah and sort of having a shorter oo and shorter or long oo or long okay? So it's going to be 4, 4, 4, 8, 2, 2, 2, 8, 2, 2, 2, 8, and 4, 4, 4. Okay? So let's start with the first one. So we're going to sit up straight. Close your eyes. We're going to go ahead and just let our breathing even out. Maybe for about 20, 30 seconds. And now we'll begin with the 4, 4, 4. So take a deep breath in. So let's go ahead and do that again. So we're going to do, it's going to be closer to 5, 5, 5, I think. So deep breath in. Good. So hopefully you kind of noticed the vibrations, felt them in different areas, or maybe you were focused on the count. Whatever you were doing is totally fine. So now we're going to lengthen that ah. Okay, so it'll be maybe 9, 3, 3 instead. Okay? So take a deep breath in. Good. We'll do that again. So 9, 3, 3. So really long 9, really long ah, oo, and Okay, so deep breath in. when you practice that on your own, if that sort of felt good to you, remember to focus on the sensation of the vibration projecting outward. Now we'll focus on the ooh in the kind of internal balance, and we're going to feel the upward flow and downward flow. It'll be 3-9-3. So we'll start out with a quick ah, a long ooh, and a short Deep breath in. Ah, and again. And now we'll move on to the being the long part. So we'll have a 3-second ah, a 3-second ooh, and now we'll really focus on that downward vibration that the creates. You're going to feel it deep within your chest and just focus on that sensation, okay? Deep breath in. Excellent. One more time. 3-second ah, 3-second ooh, 9-second Deep breath in. And now we'll close the practice with 2 rounds of even breath. 5 seconds, 5 seconds, 5 seconds. Deep breath in. And now the last breath. And afterward, we're going to sit in the silence of Om, which is actually the 4th sound, the sound of silence, which is sort of the hidden sound within Om. So some people will even say that the most important part of Om chanting is none of the syllables that you chant, but the residual experience afterward. So we're going to do one more round. We're actually going to lengthen each of the segments, the ah, the ooh, and the to 6 seconds, okay? So the other way to kind of think about it is just do it as long as you can, evenly split up, okay? So get ready, take a deep breath in. And silence. And that is how you live in the present. Okay? So, who are we rating? Maybe let's rate someone small today. And just a couple of announcements before we leave. So, we're probably going to be out next week for a super secret project. For those of you that enjoyed this experience, our month of meditation, week 3, is still ongoing. So we're doing grounding meditations on the Discord. Last thing is that on Thursday at 11 a.m. Central Time, so tomorrow at 11 a.m. Central Time, we have an Ask a Coach event about loneliness and isolation and how group coaching can help. So if you're curious about how coaching works, feel free to hop on and just ask a coach and learn a little bit about it. And then Thursday at 5:30 p.m., so tomorrow at 5:30, we have a Building Good Remote Work Habits, especially if you live in the tech industry event. So if people who have been like working remotely in the pandemic, and if y'all have been kind of struggling to be efficient, develop good habits, things like that, we're going to be having something about that. Okay. Raid dish. Okay, let's see. What is dish? Dish is live. Okay. Dish is playing Genshin Impact. We can raid. Let's raid Dish. What do y'all think? You all want someone smaller? One viewer streamer. Hi, I'm Dusky. Dude, let's do that. Hi, I'm Dusky. Oh yeah, there's a picture of something from Elden Ring on this. It's some weird, yeah, dude, this looks hype. What is this? Okay. Yeah, 161 followers. Hell yeah, dude. This art looks so cool. I don't even know what it is exactly, but check it out.
How's your work? Everything works correctly today?
Mm-hmm.